built your clock, you've hung it on the wall, but no matter how many times you start the pendulum, it won't keep running. With a little tuning, we can fix that. The pendulum is a good place to start. If it's tight where it seats on the anchor, or the parts between the crutch and the pallets are tight, the clock may not run properly. With the pendulum removed, check that all the parts move smoothly. If not, you can back the pegs out a little, or with some sandpaper you can open up the holes in the crutch. In this case, everything looks pretty good. It seemed to me that the pendulum was a little tight in the seat, so I'm just going to flip it over and sand away a little from the back face of the pivot end using 220 grit sandpaper and a sanding block. You don't need to remove very much here. Even a 32nd of an inch or half a millimeter is plenty. With that resolved, I'm going to assemble the clock without installing the pendulum. This will allow the clock to freewheel when we hang it on the wall. That accomplishes two things. First, we can see exactly how the gears are interacting as the clock runs. And secondly, it allows the gears to break in and mesh with each other. Notice that every time I assemble the clock, I'm always aligning the index marks. This ensures that each time I assemble the clock and run the clock, the same teeth are meshing together, and this simplifies the whole tuning process. Watching the clock freewheel, you can see that the gears slow at certain points. When you do this, listen for the telltale sound of gear faces rubbing against each other as they turn. Looking at it from the side, you can see this happening. This can be caused by a warped gear or excessive end play on one of the axles. I'll start by correcting the gear that has the wobble in it. First, I'm going to mark where the gear has its highest spot, so I can focus on that later. Plywood can warp when there's stresses in the different layers of the wood. The good news is you can release some of that strain by using either steam or a damp paper towel, as we've done before. Applying a little bit of moisture or steam and then flexing the gear in the opposite direction of the wobble can help relieve the stress. Be gentle and don't force the gear to flex too far or it may crack or break. It may take a few tries to get it completely true. Keep at it, go gentle, and just take your time. When you've got it close, place the single gear into the frame and give it a spin. By looking at it on edge, you'll be able to see how much wobble is left in the gear, and you can either rework it or move on as you progress. The other situation that can cause two gears to touch face to face is excessive end play. This is where there's too much space between the axle spacer and the clock frame, and the gear can move front to back and potentially touch the adjacent gear. There's a couple of ways to fix that. One way is to remove the existing axle spacer and reposition it, or if there's enough room, you can simply thin an additional axle spacer and add it to the end of the axle. And that's what we're going to go ahead and do in this case. I've taken one of the spare axle spacers that comes with the kit, and using the same technique that we used while building the clock, I'm just going to thin it out with a piece of sandpaper and a sanding block. I'm going to add this thin spacer to the lower end of the second gear. That's going to ensure that it's positioned correctly, because the depthing of all the gears is based off the second gear being immediately underneath the front face of the clock. With that done, we can now check to see how the two gears, the second and the third wheel, mesh with each other now that we've corrected the axle spacing and the wobble in the gear. I'm just going to give this gear a couple of swipes with sandpaper while I've got it out to remove any rough edges I may have raised while working on it. And then I'll assemble it into the clock with the third wheel and just double check that they're no longer touching. You can see here that the gears seem to be meshing quite smoothly, and there's no point where the faces of the gears are touching, and there's not enough axle play where they can actually move to a point where they're going to interfere with each other. So it looks like everything's good and we can move on. I'm going to reassemble the clock without the pendulum just one more time to let it freewheel and just check that none of the other gears are touching face to face. The clock is freewheeling much more smoothly now. So let's reinstall the pendulum and give it a try. It runs for a few ticks, but stops pretty quickly. The clock is designed to run when the point at the bottom of the frame is aligned with the vertical line on the wall. Small variations in how the clock is assembled can impact the angle that the clock runs best at when you actually go to hang it on the wall. During prototyping and test builds, I've built about half a dozen of these David clocks, and this one for the video has the most extreme angle of any of them I built so far. As you adjust the angle first to one side and then to the other, you'll really notice the sound of the ticking change dramatically to the point where at one end it'll actually stop running. So find the ideal spot and then mark that with a pencil. You'll know you've got it right when there's a smooth, rhythmic ticking and the pallets are swinging back and forth into the escape wheel an even amount on either side. Now the clock will run a few minutes at a time, but stops after that. So I'm going to pull it apart and sand each gear and every tooth on each gear one more time with 220 grit sandpaper. I focus first on removing a little material from the root or the groove part of the tooth, then a little off the tip of the tooth, and then the faces of the tooth. Just a little bit. You're not changing the shape of the tooth, but just removing a little material, and then go back over it with some graphite. That made a big difference, and now the clock's running quite smoothly and for at least an hour at a time. And now whenever it stops, we can look at where it stops and focus just on the teeth that are touching at that point. Now that the clock is running, it can tell you where the teeth are binding. Every time it stops, those teeth that are in contact are the ones you need to focus on. So we're going to take apart the clock and look at exactly the points of contact between each set of teeth. Take note of where they're matching and focus exactly on those teeth, just like we are here. What tends to happen is the same contact teeth tend to be the trouble spots, but just work at them a little bit at a time. You may go through several iterations, sanding the clock, applying a little bit more graphite, and putting it back together, putting it on the wall, but you don't want to remove too much material. And marking the contact spots, the alignment at the contact point where it stops with a pencil is not a bad idea, because that will show you which teeth are repeatedly causing the issue. Once the clock's running perfectly, we can come back and remove all of these marks with a good eraser, and then we'll apply some finish. And that's what we'll do in the next video. But for now, just focus on the contact points, removing a little material from the root, a little material from the tip again, and a little material from the face. on each of the gears. And you can take a look at the escape wheel and the pallets as well, and just make sure there's no rough edges on those. I can't emphasize enough to make sure that you're aligning those index marks every time you put the clock back together. It makes sure that you're starting from the same point and you're getting back to a reliable point for testing and tuning the clock. Now that the clock's running reasonably well, I'm going to install the hour and minute hands as well and use those as a timer. So every time I put the clock back together with the index marks all aligned, I'll start the clock at noon, at 12 o'clock, and see how long it runs for. So this way, if it runs for an hour, it'll stop at 1 o'clock and so forth. Each time it stops, we're going to go through the same process. Take the clock apart, mark where the teeth are matching when it stopped, and focus on those teeth. It can take a number of iterations to get this done. I really thought this clock, when I built it, that there wouldn't be much to show for the tuning, but it took about 15 taking it apart, sanding it, putting it back together, and putting back on the wall to get it to the point where it would run for the full unwind. So don't get discouraged. The clock is telling you where it's binding and how to fix it. Just focus on those teeth that are where it stopped, and that's where it's binding, and just focus on those teeth. As I'm applying the graphite here, I have had questions about what pencils to use, whether going with a really soft like 8B pencil, which is a super soft lead, is better for the clock or worse. I just go with a straight HB. It's your standard pencil. The lead is hard enough so that it's not going to break all the time when you're applying it, and soft enough that you can get a good coat on. It really doesn't matter. It's personal preference. The one that we supply with a kit is an HB, but feel free to experiment. And have I mentioned that every time you put the clock together, you need to be absolutely certain that you're aligning the index marks on the gears? If I hadn't, yeah, it's a good idea. Please go ahead and do that. What you'll generally find is each time you go through this process, the clock will run just a little bit longer. Sometimes it takes big jumps and runs for several hours longer. Sometimes there are setbacks where it'll run shorter. But in general, the average length of time the clock runs through each of these iterations that you do should get longer and longer. It's exciting to see the clock run a little longer each time you put it up. If it does stop, the procedure is exactly the same. Take it down, sand it, apply graphite, and put it back up. By now you've seen this procedure several times. It really doesn't take very long, maybe 10 minutes to take it down, take the clock apart, mark the matching gears, sand them, apply graphite, put it back together. It really doesn't take that long. And again, each time the clock should run a little bit longer. Again, there's exceptions to that, but generally. You know, you'll spend a few minutes every day until you get the clock running perfectly. We're almost there at this point. I just want to mention that if there's anything that you feel could be a little clearer, that you want more explanation on, I'd be more than happy to post a short video on that. By all means, leave a comment, or you can reach out to us at email. Just service@abong.com works, and we're always looking for feedback. More so than any of the David prototypes or the David test kits that we built during pre-production and after production to test the kit, this one was one of the most stubborn ones to get running. It took a few more tries of taking it down and sanding at the points where the gears were binding and putting it back up. If this happens, just remind yourself that the clock's telling you where it's binding. It's been about 2 weeks since I finished shooting the last bits of video and got into editing this, and the clock has been running flawlessly ever since. It gets rewound every morning, and it runs without a glitch throughout the day, and it's keeping time to within about a minute a day. That brings us to the next step, which is how to adjust the clock so it keeps time accurately. Start by setting the hands to the current time. You can just rotate the minute hand and the hour hand will follow. Allow the clock to run for about 6 hours and then check to see what the time the clock is reading compared to the time on your watch. If it's running fast, you're going to lengthen the pendulum. If it's running slow, you're going to shorten the pendulum. In this case, we're running just a little bit fast, so we're going to unwind the pendulum screw to make it a little longer. Keep repeating this process as necessary until the clock's keeping accurate time. If you find you've unscrewed the screw to its limit and it's still running fast, you can add a washer or a nut. It's a 3mm screw to the screw, just to add a little bit more weight at the bottom, and that'll slow down the pendulum a little bit. Or if it's running too slow and you've screwed the adjustment screw in all the way, you can actually remove the screw altogether. That's about it for tuning the clock. I hope you found this video useful. The next one will be finishing the clock, so check back in on the channel soon.